Welcome back to Chemical FM. This week we are joined by our Chief Sustainability Officer, Brandon Pelissero. Join with us to discover more about Ecolink's B Corp certification during B Corp Month, learning more about how we go beyond.
So we're just going to jump right into it and get started. So I would love for you to start with telling us about the origin of Ecolink and how the company got started for people who don't know about us.
So, interesting topic of how businesses start. A lot of times we hear what they do, but not why they do it. So, starting with the why, we began in 1991 after a pretty significant event, globally speaking, occurred in 1987. The Montreal Protocol was a multinational global bringing together of focus on substances that deplete the ozone layer. In the 80s, they were thinking ahead of what climate change, global warming, languages like that was starting to get into focus. The challenge is that nobody had a baseline of how to measure before versus after. And during that time span, the co-founders of Ecolink saw basically the lay of the land of the biggest chemical producers that were well entrenched in these other chemistries that were going away in terms of the bans, and really kind of rallied around bio-based renewable ingredients. Today we know a lot about orange or citrus-based chemistry or cleaners at home and at work, but back in the late 80s that was not really the case. So really it was just looking at the ongoing focus on reducing hazardous and ozone depleting substances, but also looking at what we had more of an abundance of in terms of domestically produced ingredients. So, and then the third part of that really being just where the market was oversaturated and undersaturated. So it was finding that sweet spot, if you will, where the three things kind of added up to a new business concept that wasn't out there. And as a reminder, in 1991 and 1987, there was no things such as the internet and all the things that keep us digitally connected and aware of what's going on today. So most of this was being done in conferences, trade publications, things of that variety. And if you weren't there or weren't subscribing, you weren't in the know. It wasn't as public readily available. So there was a lot of, I guess, uphill educating, as we call it, to really explain you can't get X anymore and you have to use Y, and here's how you have to do that. So it really became a very different, from the beginning, different way of communicating. It wasn't selling, it wasn't marketing, it was really almost like storytelling. Once upon a time, you could use this. Suddenly, this happened. Unfortunately, you can't use it. Fortunately, we're here to save the day. So that's the short version of a 32-year how we got here.
So would you say that was like Ecolink's first involvement with sustainability and environmental issues? And how would you say that has transitioned and evolved over time within those 32 years?
Absolutely. So as we think about kind of taglines and how we identify or encapsulate a brand or a company in a few words, Ecolink's beginning started in terms of sustainability around the concept of clean ideas for industry. We're very clear that we're in industrial cleaning, just in terms of like in cleaning as a what do we do? We don't do everything. This is really what we're focused on, but we do it for industry who uses disproportionately a lot more chemicals in their processes. So just like we have oil changes and tune-ups for our vehicles that we drive, we have that same equivalent for very big things that we all depend on, such as jet airplanes and military assets, fleets, and so forth. So clean ideas for industry in 1991 today are clean ideas for sustainability. Because what we've seen in our 30 years of being in business in terms of the beginning is that governments are now focused on this. Municipalities that have their own rail system, their trolleys, their subways, etc. We're just a lot more connected in terms of transportation. There's just more people traveling in cars and all modes of transportation. So our focus now is still centered on cleaning, and the ideas, in terms of a clean idea, is that sometimes you don't need anything. It just becomes more of an education versus uh, product-based solution. Sometimes it's just you need that information of how you can make it better. A big part of that today would be more emphasis around recycling and repurposing or remanufacturing, as they call it.
So would you say, as a certified B Corporation now, with all these initiatives, what do you think sets Ecolink apart from other companies who are not B Corps in terms of our commitment to sustainability and social responsibility?
Right. I've been getting some calls and queries as a group, not just me personally, but on behalf of Ecolink speaking today. We've fielded questions that really get kind of stumbled in the jumble, as I call it. We have ESG, environmental sustainability or sustainable, and then governance. And then we have CSR, corporate social responsibility. And there's not a gap. It's unclear of how do those two fit together, if at all. So to kind of break them down in separate, groupings, as we look at, social responsibility, it's really about people, planet, in the sort, where do we have touch points with the environment and the wildlife that depends on that. And as we think about our people as a, people first, mission-driven company, it starts with having great people who have great benefits, and our great benefits are really to make sure that your social and emotional needs today are being served, and your long term, as we live in a country that has this concept of Social Security and Medicare, which we anticipate changing over time, just given kind of the state of those federal government programs, that we really want to make sure that basic needs are met today, and that your ongoing future needs will be satisfied. Disproportionately, most workplaces do not have a strong or robust long-term retirement plan. So we really wanted to kind of focus on something that we know is a void in the marketplace for employers and employees, respectively. So we think starting with our temporary help, also known as interns, we were paying $15 an hour well before that became more commonplace. And we get excited as a B Corp of really funding and investing in future leaders that we hope we attract people who do have more of a sustainability focus, or at least ethos. On the environmental side, right now as a B Corp, just from a timing perspective, there's a huge opportunity, globally speaking, around reducing hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs. So not that long ago, the U.S., EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, had completed their phase down and establishing basically an allowance or allocation of these materials for different applications, including cleaning, including refrigeration, including insulation, fire suppression, things like that. And beginning in 2021, they reduced their footprint, at least stateside, from 100% to 90, and that number at the end of this year and by the end of 2023 will go down to 60%. And that's a huge opportunity for companies who are currently consuming high global warming potential. And that's basically a measurement of how much longer than basically CO2 will something last or stay in the atmosphere. And I was just meeting this week, ironically, with a company who was notified by their longtime supplier that they no longer have an HFC based material, and that they're actively looking for alternatives. So as we kind of think where things are today, and that phase down goes into the year 2037. So there's going to be a very long cycle or season for U.S. manufacturers and multinationals find help with that. And that's been a great opportunity and challenge for us to do that. But again, we think as part of our B Corp, we began this process as a certification in April of 2021, and then kind of had a long time or hiatus until we were formally approved in November of 2022. However, as part of that April of 2021 pledge or application, we were focused as a key performance indicator, or a KPI, to not have any HFC in our in our products of any kind. And going forward as a ongoing B Corp certification, recertification, how do we measure, the HFCs that we have replaced with something that is, either non or very low atmospheric life or, global warming potential.
So kind of building off of that, can you speak to any specific challenges or successes that Ecolink as a company has experienced in your efforts to reduce your environmental impact and promote sustainability?
The challenges we've had quite a bit. The most, I think, glaringly obvious as we think about where we are today, March 2023, is that the climate volatility has been consistently frequent and more consistently damaging. Several earthquakes very recently. The U.S. just got blanketed with snow in some places. There's a huge storm coming from Hawaii towards the west coast of California, and that will shut down businesses, which includes all the things that go with it in many cases. So supply chain and logistics have been really hampered in general by climate change. A couple of other areas that are just challenging in terms of doing the right thing is that we have an aging infrastructure, specifically to key manufacturers of the materials that are needed for that are just going out of business or through consolidations, and it just financially doesn't make as much sense economically to support product lines. We had our worst frost in Florida in 90 years in terms of citrus crops and yields. As we think about things like that as a bio-based, feedstock, we struggle with that. On the success side, I think, in terms of, lowering our environmental footprint and promoting sustainability, we, summer of 2022, became a exclusively virtual company. So as we look at kind of the carbon footprint of just having a building, whether it's, fractional or exclusively ours, we've reduced our commuting for our respective employees and such. We have, really embraced kind of the whole remote workplace in terms of virtual. Our college interns, which we've been working with for over 10 years, are now virtual, and that's given us candidly a greater reach of who we could actually physically work with by not being in person. Having a 4-day work week, just from a health and safety perspective and just wellness, self-care has been really positive in terms of the, I guess, social impact versus the environmental. And obviously just one less day to do other things. Several of our employees have really invested into volunteering, and that's become a bigger part of our B Corp initiatives, plural. So as we kind of think about those areas, how do we get the word out? That's become more fun. We've funded several scholarships, fairly low threshold in terms of workflow, but really kind of gets the message out there between social media. We're now as a B Corp being certified, looking at where our customers are and our suppliers are, upstream, downstream touch points, and figuring out how close are we physically, literally, in terms of geographically, to another B Corp. How many of our customers, at least on their digital assets, website, social media, and so forth, have a pledge towards sustainability, and whatever the version is theirs from a social, environmental, governance, how equitable are they from a diversity, equity, and inclusion perspective. So those are some, fun things to think about in terms of working with, in some cases, companies or government agencies or entities for over 3 decades, really having just something besides the product to discuss, really kind of learning more about how they're handling things like carbon counting as kind of a, future goal or plan at Ecolink. We are, aspiring to become carbon neutral. So as we do still meet, a few times a year in person and have the, carbon footprint that goes with that, planes, trains, and automobiles, how do we offset those in a way that is really not just about buying credits, but there's an additional benefit that we can provide. But I think as where we're going forward around sustainability, we've seen over our 3 decades in business that really a lot of these regulatory changes that really, mandates, they begin in Europe. Europe by far is the most restrictive, and for good reason. So they're just high density, high concentration. So any form of air quality, water quality, land, soil quality becomes a very quick problem in terms of the spread, or just using COVID times, it becomes viral, as they say. So we've seen over our 3 years of 30 years, 3 decades of where those regulations eventually come to the United States at the federal level, and then become adopted at a more maybe restrictive level at the state level. And then we're just now getting calls and queries abroad, where the problems we've solved environmentally speaking or sustainably 10 years ago are just now becoming in focus for other parts of the world. And our interest in that is, working with local people, local partners, building up partnerships where things aren't exclusively being shipped from the United States to those external markets, and adopting almost like a Coca-Cola type of, syrup, um, type of strategy. So that's fun to look forward to. I've been curious for a long time around consulting. How do we get compensated as a group for our expertise without always having to sell a bottle of something or a barrel of something? So how do we, as a group of knowledge workers, get compensated for our knowledge? And that's going to be fun and interesting to kind of see. And then we host meetings a couple times a year in person, and really strategy meetings, discovery sessions, big thinking, deep thinking. And our most recent offsite retreat was really kind of understanding on an individual level, by employee, what are the non-government organizations that really they value? What are the causes that they care about? And, thinking, where do we put our money where our mouth is? So we have some thoughts around that. That's going to be a continued conversation. But I think, aligning kind of our personal values with our, professional values in terms of spending, the majority of our week together doing one thing, it should, overlap and dovetail nicely with what people already care about. I think that's a great retention tool in terms of keeping, great, wonderful people, but also kind of a way to attract and acquire new brave thinkers.
Well, that is great. You already kind of covered my last question, which was kind of like, where are we going next? But a final kind of just bounce off right on the spot question for you would be, when we've had discussions in the B Corp community, there's some kind of like eyebrow raises when you say that we're a chemical company. So what would you say to people who are kind of, I guess, confused as to how a chemical company can be a B Corp?
So it's interesting. There are over 6,000 B Corps globally. And you'll see certain market segments well represented just because of their environmental footprint. What's important, I think, for the audience to understand is that Ecolink is just that. We're a link between problems and solutions. So as I mentioned, as a virtual company, we don't physically have a plant that physically makes the chemicals. So we have been vetting mostly family-owned businesses, mostly close to critical market areas, geographically speaking, to where we can really reduce the environmental footprint and the cost of getting, material from point of origin to port of consumption. So Ecolink has an active group of 11 partner suppliers, and who already had warehousing, who already had staffing, who already had racking and forklifts and all of that. So what we believe we've already been successful at in one regard is validating that we don't need as many chemical companies. We're kind of the non-chemical chemical company, if that makes sense. We don't have trucks, we don't have forklifts, and because other people do. And working in that way, just like we do with Airbnb for houses that are vacant, there are chemical warehouses and whatever you want to call that, filling stations, if you will, that aren't at capacity. So for us, we're not trying to be-wash or greenwash. We're acknowledging that what we do is very intentional. We're working with excess capacity. We're not here to create additional carbon just using one, and working again in communities where it's families that have been doing business for 2 to 6 decades. Some of our partners that go back over 160 years. So that's been kind of intentional for us as we, get the eyebrow raise or, but wait, you're a chemical company. Yes, we are. And here's how we, with bio-based products, here's how we promoting recycling, here's how we, with a real firm focus on HFC bans and small packaging, right sizing our packaging. A lot of the industry will require a large minimum order quantity. We have a very low minimum order quantity. We have a minimum order quantity, if that makes sense. And you just have fewer bottles. A lot of these materials, if they don't get used, have to be disposed. So we're very intentional about what you need, and we have designed our packaging around that. We're consistent with where we supply things or source things, specifically just from a quality perspective, but also from a sustainability. If we stop working with longtime suppliers, they might not be around in business, So it's being very intentional on our sourcing, on our packaging, on our manufacturing, we've consolidated our shipping. Instead of having 30 different, long, less than truckload LTLs, we've really pared that down to 3 to 5, and that we can fill up fewer trucks with more stuff. And during first year of COVID, in terms of 2020, that was huge. Filling an entire truck of just our stuff and getting it across the country saved a lot of carbon and saved a lot of people who were really scrambling at that time for hand sanitizer. So those are some of the ways that we have. We're not an apologetic B Corp, just like the other B Corps. They don't say, hey, I'm really sorry, I'm not 100%. We really own that, our score that's online, and we have identified opportunities such as being carbon neutral that we can improve upon that. Being more intentional in our give back, whether that's offsets on environmental, offsets on social. We have an awareness, and candidly, in an open book environment, our employees' vote matters. I mean, it counts. Our vendors, when they speak, mostly at the family organizational level, we want to, consistently revisit our value proposition. But yes, we are a chemical company. We just don't have the traditional footprint that most people think of when they think big plants, big smokestacks, lots of noise. Literally like a lot of just audible pollution, just in terms of all that comes in and out of a factory, but all the visuals, right? So yeah, it's been a journey already, and it's just begun.
Tune in next time as we share our platform with more voices of those working to use their business as a force for good. Chemical FM, remix, renew, and replay your chemical solutions. You can follow Ecolink on Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn.